Beis Daf is Daf Chav Beis, and we'll begin with the Mishnah on the top of the top. This Mishnah is coming to explain to us about the amount, the volume of schach that you must put on your sukkah in order to guarantee that the sukkah is kshera. And Succah miduvleles, we'll immediately see the Gemara on what miduvleles means. And if there's more shade than sunlight, kshera. So in both these cases, we know that there's enough schach to validate the sukkah. Now, when we talk about tzelsa merupsa michamsa, we can talk about the amount of schach, the volume of schach on the top of the tefanos, or we can look at the bottom, the floor, and we can see whether it's mostly shade or mostly sunlight. The Mishnah continues and says, Hama'uba, which means av, milashon av, ayin bet, means very thick. So you put an awful amount of schach, very thick volume of schach. We never came across any limitation in how much schach you could put on. You know, we always had a minimum amount of schach. You know, you've got to have tzelsa, merupsa, michamsa. Is there a maximum amount of schach? And here it's ma'uba, kibrin bayis. The Mishnah says that if you walk into your sukkah, you've got so much schach on top, it looks like a house, like a roof of a house. At night, when you look up towards the sky, you will not see the stars. Kshera, nevertheless, the sukkah is kshera. And one question that we have to ask with regard to the entire Mishnah, the Reisha and the Sefer, is: are we talking about b'di'evet? Post facto, this is not really the ideal sukkah. The Gemara immediately asks, "My miduvleles." And here the Gemara presents a machlokes, a dispute between Rav and Shmuel. Amar Rav, Sukkah aniyah. Rav understands that the word miduvleles comes from the word scarce, or it's not dense. You know, you have a piece of schach here, a piece of schach there. Keep in mind, there's no avir of 3 tfachim, otherwise that would automatically invalidate the sukkah. And according to Rav, even though the schach is very weak and very sparse, it's not dense at all, nevertheless, that's what the Mishnah tells me, the sukkah is kshera. There are no major spaces between the schach, and we have tzelsa merupsa michamsa, and therefore the schach and the sukkah is kshera. Well, Omar, kana ola v'kana yored. He has a whole different understanding of what miduvleles means. And according to his understanding, miduvleles means that the schach, we'll call it the planks or reeds that he uses as schach, one goes up and one goes down. And nevertheless, the sukkah is considered a sukkah kshera. This is called kana echad lemala, kana echad lemata, or in Shmuel's language, kana ola v'kana yored. And this is fine. The sukkah is sukkah kshera. He says the entire sukkah is made up of one kana going up, one kana going down. And at the end of the day, on a physical level, it's going to be chamsa meruba mitzelza. The sun is going to come through because every other space is open. I mean, again, there's a piece of schach on top, but the sun could come through, streaming through, and you end up with more chama, more sunlight than shade. It doesn't matter, because chamsa merupsa mitzelsa is not an issue of reality, but rather it's a legal issue. And it's a shir and schach. Here, potentially, we have enough schach so that it would be tzel samarup samichamsa if all the schach was on one level. And we're going to soon see that according to Shmuel, there's a certain mechanism here that underlies the Mishnah that allows me to view the schach as if it was all flat on one level. Had it all the schach been flat on one level, certainly it would be tzel samarup samichamsa. And even though now I don't see tzel samarup samichamsa, when the sun is shining, it's going to come in through all these openings between the different planks of schach. Nevertheless, it's considered al pi din to be tzel samarup samichamsa. The Gemara says, Rav Tana Chadav, Shmuel Tani Tarta. When we analyze the Resha of our Mishnah, the question arises, is the Mishnah giving two different scenarios, or the second phrase in the Mishnah, namely Tzel Samruf Tzmachamta, is a description qualifying the Resha? It's all one case. Rav learns it's all one case. Rav Tani Chadav, Sukkah Miduvdeles, Umay miduvleles. What does the word miduvleles mean? It means miduldeles. Miduldeles, bildul means it's very sparse. And you have a very limited amount of schach. But since, and this is the end of the Resha of the Mishnah, tzil samaruv samichamsa, therefore it's kshera. So despite the fact that the nature of the schach is that it's very sparse, but nevertheless we still have more shade than sunlight, and therefore it's ksher. So there's only one case in the Mishnah. Shmuel Tani Tarti. Shmuel does not accept Rav's reading of the Mishnah that the tzel samarup samachamsa is just an explanation for the Resha. He understands it as a separate case. And we're going to split the Resha into two parts, two different issues, two different scenarios. Miduvleles means mivulbeles. Mivulbeles means it's confused, it's mixed up. You've got one up, one down. That's called a bilbul. That's a mixture. And then v'tarte ktani, there are two different parts to the Mishnah, because sukkah mivulbeles kshera. And then the second din in the Mishnah is that what happens if you have sparse, the opposite of dense, schach? If it's tzil samarup samichamsa kshera. So in the seif of the Resha, we're talking about a case where all the schach is on the same level. It's not one schach going up and one down, which would be mivul beles. There's no bilbul here. But there's not that much schach. There are a lot of spaces in between the schach all over the place. But nevertheless, it's tzil samarup samichamsa and it's kshera. Amar Abaye. Abaye now wants to qualify Shmuel and Shmuel's understanding of the Mishnah. Lo shanu, when do we accept this principle that nivul beles, shera with one kana going up and one kana going down, el kshe'ein bein zel lezeh shlosha tfachim. Right? It doesn't mean that one is all the way up on top and one is all the way on the bottom. There has to be some connection between the two. And if you measure the space between the two, any set of two koros, where one is going up and one is going down, you'll always find that it's 2.9 tfachim. It's less than 3 tfachim. And that allows me to connect the two and apply the principle of lavud, of love. So through lavud, I can connect these various planks of schach, these various strips of schach, and therefore the sukkah is sukkah kshera. There's no way, says Abaye, that I can integrate the planks, the schach going up and the schach going down, if they're separated by a space of more than 3 tfachim, because I don't have lavud to connect the two. Amar Rav. And this statement of Rav is going to occupy our minds for quite a while. Afilu yesh bein zel lezeh shlosha tfachim. I could be machshir the sukkah even in a case where I don't apply the principle of lavud. I can completely circumvent the principle of lavud. And what I can do is, and we'll see the technical terminology for this. It's halacha l'moshe v'sina, but we'll see exactly how it's called in a minute. I can lower the higher schach down to the level of the lower schach and make it into one flat schach. So therefore, we said that the sukkah is psula, the way Abai mentioned it in Shmuel, because the distance is more than shloshet tfachim between one piece of schach and the next. Lo Amron, when do we apply that principle? El she'ein begago tefach. The one that goes up, the higher one of the planks of schach, is very narrow, doesn't have the width of a tefach. Aval yesh begago in the upper. Gago here means the upper kane. Kane is a piece of schach. Tefach, it has the width of a tefach. Shera. Says Rava, I don't need to come on to lavud in order to connect one kana with the next, the higher kana with the lower kana. I can do it through another mechanism. And what's that called? I'm reading Chavot Rami. Now, I think a mnemonic memory device to remember what the word Chavot means would be from Hoshana Rabbah. On Hoshana Rabbah, we do what's called Chibud Arava. So Chibud means to lower something. And Rabi means Ramya. Ramya means to sort of throw it down. So you imagine that the higher kana of schach, you throw it down. And then what you now have is flat schach, all equal on the same level. And in such a case, I don't need lavud. I don't need your limitation of 2.9 tefach. There's a whole discussion here about what Abai would say about Rav. But in any event, Rava says that I can apply the principle of Chavot, Urimi, which is a principle that was taught by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu back at our Sinai. We have an unbroken chain, Halacha Moshe Sinai, of Chavot, Urimi. And I can lower the higher kanim, each one, so it's on the same level. But, says Rabbi, I can only do that if each kana has a shear of ohel. The shear of ohel is one tefach. So we're going to borrow the shear of ohel, a gag. A gag for an ohel has to be one tefach in width. Here, we're going to create a gag from each one of these planks, each one of which has a width of one tefach. And that's going to allow me to activate the principle of Chavot Urimi. Chavot Urimi is similar, but not equal, to the principle that we learned 2-3 days ago, which was called Pi Tikra Yored V'Sosen. But again, Pi Tikra Yored V'Sosen, if you recall, means that I have a roof, I go to the edge of the roof, and I imagine a mechitza going down the edge of the roof. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is we're imagining a higher beam, korah, we'll call it a kaneh, as if it would lower down. So I lower it down so that it's equal on a, we'll call it a horizontal line. They are equal, and now I have schach kosh. From whence did I derive this principle that you can only use Chavot Urimi if you have a width of one tefach? That is the precondition for applying the halacha l'moshe v'sina. That v'chi isbei tefach amrin Chavot Urimi, v'chi lesbei, if it has less than a tefach, lo amrin Chavot Urimi. And I derive it this nan from a Mishnah in Masechet Olos. Koros habayis v'aliyah. Okay, so there's a bias and there's an aliyah. And what that basically means is that you have a two-floored house, but you haven't yet created either roof. You're early in the construction process. So you've begun to create a roof as a ceiling for the lower floor and another roof, or the beginning thereof, for the higher floor. But let's understand a little bit about construction of roofs. I don't know if any of you have ever been in the roofing business, but what you do is you put planks in one direction, and then what you do is you put your roof on in the opposite direction, and it leans on those original planks. So the planks are really meant just to secure your roof. And basically your planks and the roof itself are on a 90-degree angle. They're perpendicular one to the other. So he hasn't yet completed neither the roof for the lower floor nor the roof to the upper floor. He only has the planks that will serve as a basis, holding up, so to speak, the roof. After he puts up the roof, then he plasters the roof, and then he has a complete product. So now we're talking about koros habayis va'aliyah. She'ein aleim aziva, which means we have to understand that he hasn't yet put the roof down on these beams, and for sure he hasn't yet plastered the roof because he has no roof. And now the Mishnah divides up, if you have a flow chart, into two major scenarios, two major categories. Category number one, Vehein mechuvanos, it means he's got the beams. You could start either with the top level or the bottom level, it matters not. So he's got the beams on top, and directly under them, he's got the beams on the bottom. Again, as we said before, the beams are meant to hold the roof. He's not yet ready to put down the roof. So if you would look at the top beam, immediately below it, one floor down, you would see the bottom beam. They're exactly aligned, one on top of the other. That's called mechuvanos. The second category, the second scenario will be when they're not mechuvanos. You'll have a top plank here, and then you'll have airspace. And if you go down the airspace, you get the bottom plank of the lower floor. But right now, we're talking about mechuvanos, one on top of the other. And now the Mishnah in Masechet Olos goes through the various scenarios in the case of what's called tumas mes. And we're talking about a corpse. Tuma tachas achas mihen, whether or not the tuma is underneath the lower level plank or underneath the higher level plank, is tachtea tome. Wherever the tuma is, below that plank, you have a kli, you have a utensil. That utensil is contaminated with tumas mes. And the reason for that is because anything that's together with a corpse underneath a common ceiling, a common oil, is tameh. So if you have a corpse underneath, let's say, the bottom level plank, any kli which is aligned underneath the bottom level plank becomes tameh. And the same is going to be true if you have a corpse, let's say, below the top level beam. Any kalim that are on the same line are in the same oil because the beam itself serves as an oil. And therefore, tachtea tameh, everything that's underneath that same beam, so any kli that shares that oil, that beam, together with the corpse, is tameh. And again, we're going to have to stipulate that the beam has a width of 1 tefach so that it could serve as an oil. Because as we said before, the gag, the roof of an oil, must have a minimum of 1 tefach's width. Now, let's say you have tumah, meaning a corpse, underneath one beam, and you have a keli that's underneath another beam, and kolshkein if it's in the airspace between one beam and another, those kelim are not makabel tumah. The only kelim that are makabel tumah are those that share the same roof, the same beam, and that beam has a width of a tefach. Bein hatachtona le'elyona. Let's say now the corpse is in between the lower floor and the upper floor. Is beineim tameh, any kelim that are underneath the higher beam are tmeim. The Korah Elyona now in this case, which has the width of a tefach, serves as an oil. So whereas in the first case, the tumah was underneath the bottom beam, the beam of the bottom floor, and therefore any kalim below that beam are tameh. Now we have a corpse above the bottom beam, below the top beam, and once again, any kalim that will be between the top beam and the second beam, the lower beam of the lower floor, would be makabel tumah. Nothing to the left or to the right will be makabel tumah. And if you had kalim under the bottom beam, those kalim would remain tar because they are separated with the chatzitza by virtue of the bottom beam. But we're talking about kalim that are between the bottom beam, above the bottom beam, below the top beam, on a straight line from the corpse up and down. Those are all tamei. Al gabi elyona kenegda ad l'rakia tamei. Let's say now the tumah is on top of the top beam. There's nothing above it, meaning there's no ohel above it that would stop the tumah from continuing ad l'rakia. So anything above it, if let's say you were flying in a carriage, today we'd call it an airplane, and you flew over the corpse, which is located on top of the top beam, you would become tumah. And so would the carriage itself as a clue. Now the Mishnah goes on to scenario number 2. Till now, we've been discussing a case where the beam on top is exactly aligned, or shall we say it the other way around? The beam on the bottom is exactly aligned on a straight line below the top beam. Now we go on to a different case. You've got the beam on top, airspace, and when you dip down the airspace, that's where you'll see the beam of the lower floor. Hayu elyonos kibein atachtonos. Then the law changes a little bit. Tuma tachteim tachas kulam tameh. All the kalim that are underneath these koros are tmeim. And again, al gabeim keneged kenegdan ad l'rakia tameh, that we did already, right? Anything above, if the corpse is above the top level, anything straight line above, ad l'rakia is tameh. But that's not relevant to us. We want to know about kalim that are in the house, but they're not aligned underneath the same korah as the mess. And yet, in this sefer of the Mishnah Olos, everything became tameh. How is that so? Why should something become tameh when it's not underneath an oel? Right? Only a keli that's underneath the oil mess and shares the same oil with the mess contracts tumah. But here, it's bein korah l'korah. Why would it contract tumah? The tumah is only underneath one particular korah. And the answer is that this Mishnah in Olos is a manifestation of the universal principle, Halacha Moshe Sinai, called Chavot Remi. And we're going to view all the koros above as filling the space, the airspace below, flattening one straight roof, which is absolutely flat and equal in its horizontal line, so that now everything underneath any of these koros is considered part of one oil, because it's all below one continuous roof. Because what we did was, with the Achas Lamal, the Achas Lamata, we applied the principle of Chavot Remi. On Allah, but we have a brisa that embellishes this Mishnah, and in this case qualifies the Mishnah. When do we apply Chavot Uremi, equalizing all these koros and creating one continuous flat roof so that all kalim underneath are tmeim? That's only bizman sheyesh bahem tefach beineim poseach tefach. We're going to need that each one of these koros, let's talk about the lower koros on the lower level, have a width of one tefach minimum. And beineim, between one korah and another, we have a poseach tefach. We've got airspace of a tefach. Now you can apply Chavot Uremi, and then you lower the top, again, this is all imaginary, lower the top korah to fill in the airspace, which is exactly the size of the korah. Here we have Machlokes Rishonim. What happens if, for example, the korah on top is wider than a tefach, and the airspace is only one tefach? You can't really fit it in. And some Rishonim say it has to be exactly aligned, that the top korah fits in exactly to the airspace below it. Rashi doesn't seem to maintain that. Rashi just maintains that you need a minimum of a rochav of a korah, that's a tefach, and the airspace below is a minimum of an opening of a tefach, so we can fit in the korah elyona down into the airspace below it, flatten out the roof, and that's called Chavot and Remi. Aval ein beineim poseach tefach. Tachas achas mehem tamei, but beineim yal gamam tahor. However, if you don't have that width of a tefach, you cannot apply the principle of Chavot Uremi, and therefore we don't have one flat roof, and only those kalim that are underneath that same plank where the corpse is in a straight line, those contract tumah. No other kalim will contract tumah. Alma, says Rava, what do we see clearly from this Mishnah? Ki isbei tefach amrin and Chavot Remi, ki lesbei tefach lo amrin and Chavot Remi, shmamina. Fine. Rava has a clear-cut proof. I would not question this proof unless my name was Rav Kahana, as we'll soon see. Because it's a very simple calculation. The Mishnah says that the tumah of one straight roof, creating an OL cross by applying Chavot Uremi, only is conditional only on a tefach of width. But now, Rav Kahana has a problem. Yosef Rav Kahana v'kamer lo shmaita. He was conveying this sugya of Rava in the presence of his Rebbe Rav Ashi. Amar le Rav Ashi le Rav Kahana. Are you telling me kol heicha the less tefach lo amrin Chavot Remi? V'asanya, I'm going to quote to you a brisa which deals with Heter Mavui. What's Heter Mavui? You remember that we discussed the case where from the Rishus Harab you enter into a common area that is shared by many chatzeros that spill into that common area, and it looks like you're in a Rishus Harabim. So if you want to carry within that Mavui, or from any one of your Chatzeros into the Mavui, you need a Tikkun Manui. Mavui. And what's the Tikkun Mavui that's relevant to us now? It's called a Korah. You've got to put up a beam on top. Now let's discuss the following cases. Let's say you have two walls, one on the right and one on the left. At the front entranceway into the Mavui, you're going to put a beam going this way. It doesn't go all the way across. Or you'll put a half a beam here and a half a beam here. They don't touch each other. So the Brisa says the following. It goes from the right towards the left, but it doesn't reach the second kosel, or the other way around. Or you have two koros. One is going yotzes mikosel zeh, achas yotzes mikosel zeh. V'enam no goes uzu. They don't come in contact. They don't reach each other. Achos mishlosha. If the distance between the korah and the wall, or between one korah and the other, is it's less than 3 tefachim. So he doesn't have to replace it. This is fine. Why? We're going to apply the principle of lavud, kisasum dami, as if we close up the space, and the two korahs are virtually, in virtual reality, connected, or, if you will, the korah is connected to the kosel. You have a korah that goes from one kosel to the other. However, shlosham, if the distance here, the empty space is 3 tefachim or more, tzarich lavi korah acheres. Tanna Kamma says there's no salvation. You got to replace it with a different korah. And now we're about to study the dissenting view of Rab Shimon ben Gamliel.